that Catholics pray to Mary? Do you think they believe that she is just as important as Jesus is for salvation? If you do, you are in luck, because I've got a surprise for you. Welcome to the All Roads Lead to Rome podcast, the podcast that helps you understand the Roman Catholic Church and its beliefs. I'm Dr. Bickford, and today we will focus on Mary. And I want to start off by asking you to please share this podcast with your friends. Maybe they're atheists and need to see how Christianity works. Or maybe they are Catholic curious and just want to know more. If you share it, it may have a big impact on their lives. It'll certainly have a big impact on the life of this podcast as we try to grow. St. Bonaventure said, "Men do not fear a powerful army as much as the powers of hell fear the protection of Mary." That's a big statement. For Catholics, it makes sense. For Protestants and those searching for God, it can seem strange and confusing. Now, Mary has always played an important role in the life of the Catholic Church. Critics argue that Catholics worship her. They think she's treated like God himself. I mean, after all, there are statues of her in most churches, and it looks like people kneel at them and are praying to her. I assure you, it's missing the point completely. And today, we're going to look at what's really going on. Let's start with the Bible. What does it tell us about her? It tells us she was a virgin. She was visited by Gabriel the archangel and told that she would bear the Messiah. She was betrothed to Joseph. She gave birth in Bethlehem. She raised Jesus in Nazareth. She was with him throughout his ministry. She was at his crucifixion, and we have very few direct quotes from her. In fact, the last recorded statement by her in the Gospels is at the wedding of Cana, where Jesus performed his first miracle of turning water into wine in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. And she said to the attendants, "Do whatever he tells you." That's it. But if we go and do a little digging and examine a little bit of what was going on in the Old Testament and the early church, we get a much clearer picture. And this is key. The most important thing to know of all is this. Your understanding of Jesus dictates your understanding of Mary. Let me repeat that. Your understanding of Jesus dictates your understanding of Mary. If Jesus was just a good teacher and a good role model, then Mary is not important. Just like the mother of a really good teacher or a boss you had in school or at work is not important. But if Jesus is the incarnation of God, that he combines the reality of being a fully human person as well as a fully divine one, then the person God chooses to bear him is of great importance and interest. Now, tradition tells us that she died in Ephesus, which was a big Roman city in what is now the west coast of Turkey. Paul wrote one of his letters to them, and it's the book of Ephesians in the New Testament. At the time, the city was thought to have 50 to 100,000 people, and it faced the Aegean Sea opposite of what's now Greece. She was there because Jesus entrusted her to the care of the Apostle John while he was on the cross, and that is where John spent much of his later life, working as an evangelist and then as the bishop of the city. By the 2nd century, so shortly after the year 100, church fathers like Irenaeus were calling her the second Eve. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Jesus is referred to as the second Adam, meaning that just as the first Adam brought death into the world through original sin, Jesus, the second Adam, brought the victory of life over death. And so Irenaeus is arguing that just as Eve had a role in the downfall, Mary has a role in the restoration. In the 3rd century, a hymn called the Sub Tuum Praesidium, meaning under your protection, was being carved into the catacombs, the graves of Christians, and it was sung in churches, and it's still sung in Orthodox churches today. Here's the text in English. "We fly to thy protection, O Holy Mother of God. Do not despise our petitions in our necessities, but deliver us always from all dangers, O glorious and blessed Virgin." Officially, her role in church doctrine was first established at the Council of Ephesus, same city, held in AD 431, where she was defined as the Theotokos. Theotokos is a Greek word meaning God-bearer. It is recognizing that if Jesus is God incarnate, then this woman, Mary, is the mother of God incarnate, the mother of God. This means that she's not someone randomly chosen to give birth to Jesus, but is the most perfect human ever to live, because she had to bear being pregnant and giving birth to the very incarnation of God. And by the way, that council was in the year 431, but the term was being used in Egypt before the year 250. So by 431, when it was made official, it had already been a very old idea in the life of the church. And then later, at the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451, it was reinforced. There was a debate about whether Jesus was really both fully human and fully divine at the same time. The council came to see that Jesus had to be, and that if this is true, then the role of Mary as the God-bearer is a uniquely important one in human history. Again, once you define your understanding of who Jesus is, then that determines your understanding of who Mary is. Now, many of the great theologians and writers of the church wrestled with what this can mean, and there were different opinions. Many came to believe that it must have been that in God choosing Mary for this role, then he must have caused her to be born without the original sin that the rest of us are born with. And we call this the Immaculate Conception. You may have heard of churches or schools bearing that name. It signifies that Mary was born pure without the original sin that stains all of us. Some struggled with this idea. The great Thomas Aquinas argued in the 1200s that if she was immaculately conceived, then Jesus wasn't born to save all of humankind, because she would have been the exception to the rule. His concern was later resolved by Duns Scotus, and it's a fascinating one, but one for us to explore another time. So you can follow the church wrestling with her role, and gradually consensus understanding arose, and it was cemented into official church dogma in two stages. The first one was in 1854, and Pope Pius IX made the Immaculate Conception an official dogma of the church. It didn't come out of the blue. As I said, it was the conclusion of a discussion that went back to the very beginning of the church. The other part came in 1950, when Pope Pius XII promulgated the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary. There's a college not far from me in Massachusetts called Assumption, and this is where they get their name. The Assumption idea was another conversation that had been going on in the church since the very beginning. And it's argued this way. If the consequences of original sin is death, and Mary's Immaculate Conception mean that she was free from original sin, then wouldn't she also be free from death? So would she be bodily assumed into heaven the way Enoch and Elijah were in the Old Testament? That's an honest question and a very interesting one. In the Orthodox churches, they concluded that she did die, but at the moment of death was bodily assumed into heaven. That way her body would not experience decomposition. That's called the dormition of Mary, the dormition of Mary. But whether she was assumed into heaven just before death, as Catholics understand it, or just after, as the Orthodox understand it, that isn't the biggest of differences. They both point in the same direction. And by the way, here's an interesting side note. Catholics have always been interested in relics of saints. Now, when we talk about relics, there are three classes of relics. First-class relics are parts of a saint's body. Second-class relics are things that they wore or owned. And third-class relics are things that have touched their first-class relics. One goal of the use of relics is to have them placed under the altars of churches, anticipating the time described in the book of Revelation, where the martyrs were under God's altar in heaven, waiting for the end time to arrive. Relics are fascinating, and they play a big role, but it's worth noting that there are no first-class relics of Mary. We know that she died of sickness or old age, not from persecution, and collecting relics of this incredibly important person would have been easy and very important. But no one has ever claimed to have one. And this shows what the understanding of her from the very beginning was. And even more interestingly, there has always been a healthy black market of fake relics. And yet, everyone knew from the beginning there was no point in even pretending you had a relic of Mary. That's something to wrestle with, because that goes back to the very beginning of the church. Again, we'll talk about relics in another episode. All right, continuing on. Today, there are many names that Mary goes by. She's referred to as the Blessed Virgin Mary, as the Queen of Heaven, as the New Eve, as the Madonna. Madonna comes from two Latin words, Mia Domina, meaning my lady, and Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Cairo, and others. These are places where there have been apparitions of her. Apparitions also will be a topic for a future episode. Okay, so that's the historical and doctrinal stuff. Let's take a look at some of the key images of her role. We're taking these from the Bible and from Jewish understandings at the time she walked on earth. A tremendous resource for really going deeper into this topic is the book Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary by Brand Pitre, P-I-T-R-E. Brand Pitre. It's a phenomenal book and an easy read, and it goes much deeper than I am able to on here. Let's start with the Catholic notion that Mary is the Queen of Heaven. The Bible is clear that Jesus sits in judgment at the right hand of God, meaning Jesus is the King of Heaven. Well, why would Mary play an important role too? Well, that comes from an understanding that people at the time of Christ would have had about who a queen is. In fact, it was so well understood at the time, no one would have had need to mention it. But over the centuries, we may have forgotten it. So today, when you think about a queen, you assume she's the wife of a king. Queen Camilla of England is married to King Charles of England. This wasn't that way in the Old Testament. The most obvious example, comes from 1 Kings, chapters 1 and 2. In this story, David is quite elderly and near death, and two of his sons are vying to replace him. And in chapter 1, verses 16 to 18, we read this, quote, "So Bathsheba went to the king in his room. The king was very old. Abishag the Shunammite was attending to the king. Bathsheba bowed and did obeisance to the king, and the king said, 'What do you wish?' End quote. And then she asked for a favor." Bathsheba and David have a bit of a history. But among the many wives he had, she was always his favorite. And he had promised her that her son Solomon would succeed David as the king, even though technically he was 11th in line to the throne by today's standards. So how did she approach him? She bows and does obeisance, meaning her bows show great respect and deference. Even though she's the wife of a king, she's his subject and has to show the greatest of respect for his office. Well, as you continue to read, the conflict gets resolved, David dies, and Solomon becomes king. In chapter 2, we read this, starting in verse 19. Quote, "So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. The king rose to meet her, and he bowed down to her. And then he sat on his throne, and he had a throne brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right." End quote. The king bows to his mother. And why does he bring a throne for her and put her at his right hand, meaning she has more authority than anyone else but the king? And the answer is, it's because she is the queen. Well, why would the mother of the king be queen instead of his wife? And the answer to that is simple. Back then, the kings practiced polygamy and had lots of wives. They married some for love and others for political alliances. The cementing of political alliances through marriage has existed for most of human history and, interestingly, continues into our time. If that sounds strange, remember this. Kaiser Wilhelm, the German leader who was deposed at the end of World War I, is said to have made this comment, quote, "If our grandmother was alive, none of this would ever have been allowed," end quote. His grandmother was Queen Victoria of England, and the leaders of most of the major European powers were, in one way or another, related through marriage for political alliances' sake. In fact, in World War I, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were all first cousins. And so when Wilhelm says that, he's saying that none of them would have gone against their grandmother. A great piece of historical trivia. So, in the times of the Old Testament, we are told that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Just let that be. Which one gets to be queen? Well, who is the most trusted? Who is in the best position to understand how a kingdom needs to be run? Who is the best one to understand the family lineage? It's a tough problem, but one that is easily solved if you make the king's mother the queen. Is this really true? Well, in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, where we get most of the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the king's mothers are listed with the kings 16 different times. No wives are ever mentioned. In the book of Jeremiah, when he's giving a prophecy of the upcoming exile to the Jews, he says in chapter 13, verse 18, and it's kind of harsh, he says, quote, "Say to the king and the queen mother, quote, 'Take a lowly seat, for your beautiful crown has come down from your head,' end quote." This was the practice. And everyone at the time of Jesus would have remembered it. And if he is to be the king of the Jews, the automatic conclusion is that Mary is the queen. That's why she has that name. And that's why it's common to see renderings of Mary wearing a crown. And this is important because if she is the queen of heaven, she needs to be afforded proper respect by us. But there's something more. At the end of days, when there will be a battle in heaven, we meet someone. In the book of Revelation, chapter 12, the devil does battle with a woman wearing a crown. The crown means that she is the queen, and the crown has 12 stars, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Since the time of the Reformation, many Protestants have tried to argue that this woman represents the church, or she represents all people. The reason for this is if we treat the queen as an individual woman, then the only conclusion we can draw is that she is Mary, which goes against Protestant understanding of who she is. Well, why does this matter? If Bathsheba interceded with King David on behalf of Solomon, then why can't we ask the Queen of Heaven to intercede with the king for us? If Mary is the Queen of Heaven, then she has a position of extreme importance and should be given the appropriate honor for that. On this subject alone, we could do multiple episodes of this podcast, and there's a lot that's been written on her queenship. I'm just citing this little bit to whet your appetite to want to learn more, because there is a lot more to learn. All right, let's move on. How else are we to view Mary? She's also referred to as the new ark. To understand this, we first need to understand the old ark. In the book of Exodus, after the Hebrews fled Egypt, Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai, and God gave him the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. Moses didn't write the 10 Commandments, God did, and gave him these tablets. When Moses came down from the mountain, God gave very specific and very detailed instructions on a box that was to be built to house them. That box is the ark. And if you've seen the very first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, this is what he's looking for. The ark held the law, the 10 Commandments, that defined the nature of the relationship of the people to God. During their wandering the desert, it always had the most prominent place in their camp and was placed in something called a tabernacle, a big tent. Once Israel was established, King Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem, and the temple had 2 primary purposes. One was to administer the sacrificial system, where people would bring offerings of either thanksgiving or atonement. And then the second purpose is it was to house the ark. The ark was kept in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and only the high priest could enter that space, and he could only do so 1 day a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, to offer atonement for the sins of the whole nation over the past year. We are told that in the desert, God would meet Moses in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle, and the Bible says the whole place was overshadowed by God when he spoke to Moses. Much the same way we are told the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary when she conceived the Messiah. The ark was also seen as the place where heaven and earth met. Jesus, as the incarnation of God, is literally God walking among us, heaven and earth meeting. Furthermore, just as the ark held the law that defined the people, Mary held the Savior in her womb that would define the church. But the ark had 2 other things in it as well, besides the 10 Commandments. It had an urn of manna, put there as a reminder to the people of the heavenly manna, or bread, that fed them while they wandered in the wilderness in the book of Exodus. It also contained a rod called the rod of Aaron. It was used as a test to show that God had truly called Aaron and his descendants to serve in the priesthood of the Old Testament. Do you see the parallels? The ark held the Ten Commandments, the words which define the people. Within Mary was contained the Word made flesh. The ark contained the urn of manna, which fed the people. Within Mary was Jesus, the bread of life. And the ark contained the rod of manna, declaring Aaron the high priest. And within Mary was Jesus, the high priest of heaven. And by the way, I mentioned that the woman with the crown in Revelation 12 is Mary. If you back up one verse to the very end of chapter 11 in Revelation, verse 19, we read this, quote, Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. End quote. And why is this? Because the next verse is the beginning of chapter 12, which I've already read. Quote, A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. End quote. Mary is the ark in the temple of heaven. So as the ark played a key role in the life of Israel, Mary plays a key role in the life of the church. And the church has always known this. Again, this is a subject that entire books have been written on. It's a profound idea, but I'd like to move now on to the next piece. And this next piece is the Catholic doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. It's important that this be true for Catholics because it further shows the unique and highly honored place that she holds in the church. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 30 to 34, Gabriel tells Mary that she's going to become pregnant. Not that she is pregnant, but that she will become pregnant. He doesn't say when, but he does tell her what to name the baby. In reply, she says, in English it'll often say, but how can this be? I'm a virgin. And they'll tell you there's a footnote. If you go to the footnote, you get the more accurate translation from the original Greek. And the more accurate translation says, how shall this be since I do not know man? Now, if she's engaged, she should not be surprised. One would expect to hope for children and just wonder when they will come, whether it be a year after the wedding or maybe at some further date. But her response is different. She's not expecting to become pregnant, and she's confused by what Gabriel says. It is argued that for her to say, I do not know man, means I don't engage in sexual relations with any man. Which is like saying, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't watch professional soccer. When you make one of those statements, there's no reason why you should assume that I would start to do any of those things at any point in the future. So if Gabriel were to come to me and tell me I'll be drunk at some point, my reaction would be one of surprise, and I would say, how can that happen when I don't drink? The same is true of Mary. How can this be since I do not know man? What's going on? Well, we now have a better understanding of the first century life, and there were people that were actually dedicated to perpetual virginity, just like there are monks and nuns with the same vows now. In Luke chapter 2, verses 36 and 37, when Mary and Joseph bring the newborn Jesus to the temple, the prophet Anna meets them. And the Bible tells us she had once been married for 7 years, but after her husband died, she spent the rest of her life at the temple praying. When she encountered the newborn Jesus, she was 84 years old. Who is this? I always assumed that she was some random person. But how would she survive all those years just praying in the temple? It would be reasonable to conclude that there was some sort of support network, which means she wasn't alone. Others were dedicated to the same thing. And it looks like Mary was one of them. Both Josephus and Philo, two very important writers about Jewish life at the time of Christ, wrote about consecrated virgins and widows that served in the temple. So, if Mary is a consecrated virgin dedicated to God, then that begs the question, well, okay, if that's her, then who is Joseph? He's probably a relative that betrothed her just in order to give her protection from other men. She had the legal protection of being someone's wife or fiance and would be under no pressure to marry anyone. There's also a tradition from the early church that he was a much older relative who had become a widower, and he betrothed her to protect her from other men, but that he then died of old age before Jesus began his ministry, which is why we never see him during Jesus' time. Now, you might want to challenge that by saying, hold on. Matthew chapter 1 says, quote, "But Joseph had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son," end quote. In English, it sounds like one thing, but in the original Greek, it implies a different meaning. The Greek word here, until, is hios. And this word doesn't assume anything will take place after. So if I say, I won't eat ice cream while I'm on a diet, you can assume that when the diet is over, I'll then eat ice cream. And that's a common English understanding. But there's another way in English to understand the word until, and it catches the Greek word. It would be to say, I won't have another drink of bourbon until the day I die. Does that use of the word until mean that I will drink bourbon on the day I die? No. It means I'll never drink it. So Matthew 1 has that connotation. She remained a virgin. There are other examples, but it's just a translation thing, and that's not particularly interesting for us to get into here. So let's move on. But before we do, why is translation a problem? Well, at the time of Christ, Israel was under the control of the Roman Empire, which spoke Latin. But Latin was only used in dealing with the government. Culturally, the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel was, that world spoke mostly Greek, and pretty much everyone used it. So if you're an educated Jew at the time of Christ, you would speak Aramaic, which is what Hebrew had evolved into. You would speak that with your family. You would speak Greek if you met any foreigners. And you would speak Latin only if you had to deal with the Romans on government business. Now that reminds me of an old joke. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who only speaks 1 language? An American. That's because so few of us seriously ever master another language, which is really too bad. So in first century Israel, most people would be bilingual or possibly trilingual. Anyway, when the New Testament was written for a church that had already spread beyond Israel, it was written in Greek to address a much wider audience, which makes sense. However, Biblical Greek doesn't always translate well into English. There are times where there is no one-for-one correspondence for words. For example, Greek has 4 different words for different kinds of love, and all 4 are used in the Bible. But English only has 1 word for love, so we lose some of the subtlety when we translate any of them. There's another problem with Greek, and that's the grammar. English grammar is very strict. Greek grammar is not, which is why when you read some of Paul's sentences in his letters, they seem to go on for a really long time with lots of commas and semicolons. This is why there are so many different versions of the Bible in English. Different translators will make different decisions about how best to translate and convey meaning. The official Latin version was translated by St. Jerome around the year AD 400. It was called the Vulgate. Originally from the same Latin word as vulgar, meaning it was the language of the Latin people, which was considered vulgar by the Greeks. Anyway, the Vulgate was the Bible used in Catholic churches until the 1960s. So when we go deep into Bible study, we often get dragged into translation debates. And that's one thing if you're in a class with notebooks and dry whiteboards, but not for podcasts. So let's move on to the next topic. Just know that stuff's all there. All right. So the next question is, did Jesus have brothers and sisters? The Bible says he did. But guess what? We have another translation problem. And we have a problem with the fact that there are very few names for people, and we often can easily mistake 2 people with the same name. So here's an example. In the first 6 verses of Mark chapter 6, we read this. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house, end quote. And he could do no deeds of power. Seems cut and dry until you read Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, which takes place at the cross just as Jesus dies. Quote, there were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joses and Salome. These used to follow and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem, end quote. And on Easter morning, we read this in Mark 16, quote, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Wait, so are those whose children are James and Joses and Salome? Are they Mary's or are they Mary's? Do you see the problem? In Luke chapter 24, verse 10, we read this on Easter morning. Quote, now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other woman with them who told this to the apostles, end quote. In Galatians 1, verse 19, Paul refers to the same James as being the Lord's brother. So, what's the problem? 3 guesses, and they're all linguistic. The Greek word for brothers is adelphoi. It's the same word that's used for any close relatives. Here's another example. In John 19, verses 25 to 27, at the crucifixion, we find Mary, the mother of Jesus, her sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. There are 3 Marys there. Do you wonder why Mary and her sister have the same name? What kind of parents do this? It makes no sense. But if we take the word adelphoi and read it to mean any type of relative, then what if it's cousin? Then we have Mary, her cousin Mary, who's the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. If you read it that way, then it means that James and John are sons of Mary and Cleopas, not Mary and Joseph, which I think makes them second cousins of Jesus in the English usage. All right, here's one other piece of important information. I'm sorry for throwing all these scripture passages at you on our podcast, but I'm trying to give you a flavor more than give you stuff to memorize. In Mark chapter 7, verses 9 to 13, Jesus condemns a practice where people could twist the meaning of the law to get out of the care of their parents. He sees the care of parents as being so important that it is basically a capital offense not to do so. Yet, in John 19, verses 26 and 27, what does Jesus do from the cross? Quote, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, woman, here is your son. And then he said to the disciple, here is your mother, end quote. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home, end quote. We know the beloved disciple is John himself, and John was not related to Jesus. So if James and Joses are Jesus' brothers, it strongly falls on them to care for their mother. Like it would be a capital crime not to care for their mother. But if they're not, if they're cousins or nieces or nephews or third cousins twice removed or whatever, then one of Jesus' final actions in his earthly ministry was to ensure the care of his mother who had no other children. Do you see this? Not rocket science. So, Greek may have 4 words for love to English is 1, but English has all these terms for relative, cousins, nieces, nephews, and other relatives where the Greek at the time really didn't. We have even terms in English that few of us know today, like third cousin twice removed. I don't even know what that means, but it's out there in English. We're that specific. All right. If all of this is new to you, it's a lot. And I promise you, I'm only scratching the surface. The analysis on each of these points goes much deeper and is much more technical than I can do in this episode. But these notions were always part of church teaching. Shortly before St. Jerome started translating the Bible into Latin in the late 300s, he was asked to take on a side project, a piece defending the perpetual virginity of Mary. And he flat out refused because he argued no serious Christian would question that doctrine. But he was pressed upon, and he finally wrote a book called Against Helvidius. And it makes many of the arguments I'm showing you here today. He thought no one doubted it, but he ended up writing it because he found there were some who did. It's always been a core belief of the church until the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. They needed to differentiate themselves from the church. They needed to disagree with a lot of topics, and the doctrine of Mary was an easy one to disagree with because a lot of the understanding wasn't that clear at that point. Now, most Protestants assume that denying Mary any special role was always the case, but it's only true for them. Catholics and Orthodox have always and continue to call her blessed, just as she anticipated in Luke 2, verse 48, when she said, quote, "For he, God, has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed," end quote. Finally, I should say a word about the Hail Mary prayer. In Latin, it's called the Ave Maria. Have you ever heard that great piece of music called the Ave Maria? It's the Hail Mary prayer set to music. The first line is, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." Where does that come from? It's a direct quote of the Archangel Gabriel in Luke 1:28. To say someone is full of grace is a big deal. It's to make them basically the greatest human ever to live. See, you and I have God's grace in us, but we also have sin, temptation, and other things within us as well. There's some grace, but there's all this other stuff too. The angel is saying to her, she is full of grace. None of the bad stuff. She's the most perfect human ever. The next line, "Blessed art thou among women," which is a beautiful rendering of Luke 1:30, where Gabriel says, "Do not be afraid, Mary, you have found favor with God. Among women, she's been truly blessed with God's favor." The next line of the prayer, "And blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus." That's a direct quote from Elizabeth when Mary visits her when she's pregnant in Luke 1, verse 42. Word for word. For a long time, that was the full prayer. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." But then, in the 1400s, we start to see it with another part added, which is the rest of the prayer today. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death." Think about that. When people pray it, are they praying to Mary, or are they asking Mary to pray for them? Hear it again. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death." Just as Bathsheba interceded with David on behalf of Solomon, we're asking Mary to intercede on behalf of us, which isn't strange. If I ask you to pray for me, is that any different than asking her to? To be honest, for me, it does. When I ask people to pray for me, I usually go to the people with deeper spiritual and prayer lives. For me, there's an implicit assumption that their prayer may be more efficacious because they take prayer more seriously. Well, if I'm going to go up that ladder of holiness, who holier to approach than the Mother of God herself? All right. The doctrine of Mary can be a challenging one, especially if you come from a Protestant background where there's a significant effort to downplay her role to nothing. Looking back on it, I kind of find that confusing, but it is what it is. In Protestant circles, there's a big idea that when each of us dies, our goal is to hear Jesus say to us when we enter heaven, "Well done, good and faithful servant," which is a quote from the parable of the talents, that when we go to heaven, the first thing we hear from Jesus saying is, "We did a good job." I'm at the point in life now where I think many of them will hear from Jesus, "Dude, what do you have against my mom?" That could be a bad quote, translation. Who knows? All right, there's a lot more to say. I plan on doing an entire episode of the Rosary, and we'll actually cover the miracle of the Battle of Lepanto with that episode. I hope also that I can do more episodes in the future on how Mary should be understood. But just remember this. Your understanding of Jesus will dictate your understanding of Mary. If you struggle with what I've said about Mary, it may be due to your understanding of Jesus, and that would be a better place to start. And please be careful not to underestimate her importance. Do you remember my quote from St. Bonaventure that I started this episode with? "Men do not fear a powerful army as much as the powers of hell fear the protection of Mary." They know exactly who she is. And the church has always known exactly who she is as well. But if you're struggling with it, my suggestion to you is to just let it be for a while. It took me a while to read, think, and pray and understand her role before it all fell into place. You don't need to force it. Just let it be there. Watch others and learn from others, and you'll see how it starts to fit. But I will also tell you this. As your understanding develops, it will indeed be further proof to you, as it was to me, that all roads lead to Rome.